On Friday, I met a woman, a right-handed woman, who had been injured on her right arm. And her injury made it so that she found it very difficult and painful to shake with her right hand. So she asked her left-handed friends what to do, convinced that they would have an answer for her, that they would know the etiquette for how to shake hands as a left-hand dominant person. She was really surprised to learn that the etiquette was that they still shake with their right hands. While they may use their left hand for personal things like handwriting, in social settings, they were simply expected to conform to the majority. They were expected to use their less dominant hand in order to make others more comfortable. Now, how many of us right-handed people ever thought about our privilege when it comes to handshaking? How many of us ever thought what it would be like to be a left-handed person in a right-handed world?
We operate in our right minds, though.
We as a culture, we're right-hand normative, aren't we? Now, I doubt very seriously whether Jesus cared much about hand dominance, but it illustrates a point, doesn't it? God's kingdom, what we sometimes call the beloved community, was meant to be a place where what was normative was flipped on its head, where for the first time, the less dominant members of the community, those who were marginalized, felt comfortable. And those who had long taken their dominance and their privilege for granted, their own normativeness, they were made to feel just a little less comfortable for the sake of the other. Now imagine for a moment that I had told all of you to shake with your own dominant hand, whatever that might be. How many of you would have been shaking with your right hand? How many of you would have been shaking with your left? All right, so we have two left-handers here in this whole room? Okay. So for the majority of us, the experience as right-handed people of simply all of us shaking with our dominant hand would have been pretty normal and natural in most of our handshakes with people. It would have just felt like any other handshake. Except when we encountered that rare lefty, right? And then we have to navigate that awkward left to right squeeze, you know what I'm talking about? Or maybe reach out with our non-dominant hand, break the rules, just to make it more comfortable. Now you left-handed folks, on the other hand, no pun intended, you would have felt awkward the entire time with nearly every interaction here in this room. Until, of course, you actually found each other, your fellow lefty, and were reached out to with a compatible hand. You might have just given up, or pretended to be a right-hander because you would have got tired after a while, probably, of navigating that awkward left-to-right handshake. That's what happens when things have been so skewed toward a certain group for so long, and we simply try to level the playing field. It usually doesn't actually fix things. We have to completely reverse what is normative and who has power for things to actually start to shift or feel more comfortable for those who have been for so long on the margins. Any professional woman will probably tell you this. Now, women for quite a while now have been allowed into the workplace, given a seat at the boardroom table. But women to this day are still struggling to make it into positions of power. In a world where men have dominated the airtime, women often have to elbow their way into a conversation just to be heard. Say something 10 times more than the guy next to them in order to get their idea to gain traction. It's just so normative in our culture to interrupt women, to fail to listen to women, to skip over women, or to give the man sitting next to them credit for her idea because he repeated it 2 minutes after she did. Now, I'm not just pulling this out of thin air. There have been numerous studies conducted on this, and one of the interesting results of those studies is that usually the men in the room have no idea this is happening. Some of the women don't either because we're just so used to it. Perhaps the only way to truly break the normativity of male dominance would be if men in the room intentionally left space for the female voices by choosing to speak last, if at all. Or maybe if we actually flipped what has been so historically true, and instead of having male-dominated boardrooms, made sure that we had more females in the room. Imagine. The same goes for white people in a room with black or brown voices. In order to really make things better for the marginalized, you have to fully flip the tables, at least for a time, so people can learn the new normal. You have to be willing to give up your seat, give up the microphone if necessary. Anything less, and the marginalized stay in the margins. I think Jesus understood this. I think it's why when he was giving his table manners lessons, he doesn't just tell those in places of privilege, oh, why don't you just move down a few seats? There was a rabbi who came 80 years after Jesus, Rabbi Simeon, who did suggest this sort of moderate change in table manners. But Jesus' version is much more radical than that. He instructs them to take the lowest spot. This is what table meals looked like in Jesus' time. The host and the guest of honor probably would have been somewhere up here, and then radiating out from them would have been the seats of honor in order going away from them. And of course, these people, these Pharisees Jesus was instructing with this message, they may have thought Jesus meant that they were just supposed to move to the spot of the lowest guest, which would have been the seat of furthest from the host and that guest of honor. But Jesus demonstrates at the Last Supper that he meant something a little different, right? That he actually meant the spot of the lowest servant, the slave, the prostitute, or the child. The ones who didn't have a seat, who stood in the kitchen, or if they were lucky, may have found a seat back here, behind the feet of those who were reclining. Now, can you imagine eating with a bunch of stinky feet in your face? Might have been why the servants insisted on washing your feet when you first got there, right? Jesus also noticed something else, right? He noticed who wasn't at the table, who wasn't even invited to the table. He noticed that the only people invited were those who could reciprocate. Now, Roman dinner parties were used much like our political fundraisers or business networking dinners might be used. They were used for networking and fundraising and getting your name out there. The currency of Roman dinner parties was power. But Jesus tells the Pharisees that the currency of God's dinner table, God's feast, is actually humility, love. I wonder how often we pay attention to who's not in the room. I wonder how often we really invest in those who can't reciprocate, who can't pay us back. I wonder how often we engage in the practice of giving up our seats of privilege so that what is normative can be flipped on its head. I wonder how often, even over here in our fellowship hall, we trade seats from that seat by the person who's our favorite person in the room, and instead of sitting there, we go sit by the newcomer, by the slightly scrubby or smelly person who didn't come to worship but just showed up for fellowship because they were hungry. How often do we do that? Sometimes it really is that simple. Our tables, whether they be our home dinner table, the tables here at church, the food court at the mall, even the boardroom table, or that line at the grocery before a hurricane. Those are all places where we practice being kingdom people, where we practice humble, giving, serving, hospitality to the people around us. It's where we change what is normative. Now, many of you know back in April, our son Jacob had surgery. And when we arrived at the hospital, we told everyone that we were Jacob's two moms. We introduced ourselves over and over again to receptionists, to administrators, registrars, nurses, doctors, anesthesiologists, and of course, his surgeon. Now, Jacob's surgery was only 45 minutes, and we waited in the surgical waiting room, where a very nice elderly lady ran the desk. She even offered our very cranky baby Lizzie that morning some of her own crackers to munch on. When the phone rang, we heard her say Jacob's name, and we knew he must be out of surgery, so we started to gather up all our belongings, ready to go back to the recovery room. But when she turned around, she informed us that only one of us was going to be allowed back to see him. It seemed a bit odd, but I thought maybe this is just their policy. Only one family member in the recovery room. So quickly we decided that I was going to stay back with Lizzie and Julie was going to go to Jacob. Now I paced nervously in that waiting room, Lizzie in my arms, checking my cell phone constantly, waiting to hear how he was doing after surgery. Soon another call came to the receptionist. Another child was out of surgery, and I watched as she escorted both parents back to the child's room. And I kind of scratched my head. It's interesting. And then, of course, my worst case scenario reel in my head started going, and I started thinking maybe something went really wrong. Maybe that's why only one of us was allowed back. Finally, another call came to the reception desk. This time it was Jacob's nurse saying I could come back, and the nice volunteer walked me back into recovery. And as soon as we entered the hallway, I could tell instantly why Julie hadn't been able to text and tell me how things went. I could hear Jacob screaming all the way down the hallway. You see, our mostly nonverbal special needs child hadn't understood when we had explained what was going to happen. And so he woke up confused and in pain and screaming for his moms. When I got back to his room, Julie told me when she got back there, she had asked immediately why I hadn't been allowed to come back. Jacob's nurse looked in the chart and said, well, it says here that she's Jacob's auntie, and only parents are allowed back. They quickly rectified the situation, but I missed being with my kid right after surgery who was scared and needing us. Not because of a particular person's homophobia. I really don't think anyone intentionally discriminated. But because we live in a heteronormative world that sees two women with a child and can't imagine that they could both be that child's parents, even when they're being told so over and over and over again. Even with changes in laws, it takes a lot of intention, a lot of awareness, and a lot of space making for us to break the pattern of heteronormativity, for LGBT families just to be seen. Just as it will take a lot of intention and awareness and space making for white normativity and privilege to be dismantled. Or for that matter, for patriarchy, sexism, ableism, nationalism, or elitism to be dismantled. I really wonder what happened that day with the Pharisees. Did they all get up and just switch seats right there on the spot? Did their battle for the seat of honor suddenly turn into a battle for the lowest seat? No, you take that seat. No, really, I insist. No, you, please. Did they go out into the streets and invite all those who weren't invited to the table? Those who may never have been invited to a dinner like this, did they do that right there in the middle of the dinner? What a beautiful thing that would have been. But I kind of doubt it. The early church, however, did get the chance to practice Jesus' table manners, since every gathering they held was around a meal. Yes, Jesus intended to change much more than how people ate together. But that was a start. And it seems that at least in part, those early churches did attempt to practice Jesus' table manners. If you could learn to put others first at the dinner table, you might learn to do that in other parts of your life as well. And indeed, for all of those who came into these early church gatherings, these dinner parties, it was good news. Can you imagine walking in as a slave or a woman and actually having a reclining spot at the table? Or at the very least, a spot at the feet and not being relegated to the kitchen? It's not hard to see why this movement gathered followers so quickly or why people were attracted to it. Because the early church, faults and all, they were trying to model beloved community. And it was good news for those who walked into their midst. What I find hard about Jesus' table manners is that we have to a large extent lost our practicums. We don't sit down to table with each other nearly as much as they did in the ancient world. And while this communion table, while it's very important, in most churches it's become largely symbolic. Symbolic rather than a place where we really practice putting others first, or investing in those who can't reciprocate, or getting to know strangers. We don't even actually sit down at this table, right? It's why I love so much our breakfast church once a quarter. It's why I'm excited that during our time of renewal this spring, while I'm on sabbatical, I'm going to have the opportunity to visit some of the places where the early church met and see some of those rooms. And I'll have the opportunity to learn from modern-day cultures around the Mediterranean about how they practice hospitality and welcome strangers to their table. I'm also excited that during that time, you'll have the opportunity to spend a weekend with Reverend Dr. Mike Graves, the author of Table Talk, and explore for yourselves these radical meals of that first century church and what we can learn from them. You're also going to have the opportunity to participate in a number of meals at restaurants run by first-generation immigrants and in homes of Good Sam members with people from Head Start and the AIDS Partnership. You'll have a chance to be at table with each other over and over again during that time of renewal. And I truly believe we will see glimpses of the kingdom as we sit down together and share meals in this radical way that Jesus instructed us to do. Thanks be to God that beloved community isn't just something elusive, but is something as simple as relearning how we eat